We've reached a point in our cultural and political discourse where the left's narratives are no longer just wrong. They're downright comical. It's like watching someone try to juggle flaming torches while insisting the fire is a social construct. They're quick to shout about justice, equity, and science, but the second you peel back the layers, you find a cocktail of contradictions, selective outrage, and a blatant disregard for the very facts they claim to champion. And who better to exemplify this circus than Hasan Piker? A man who can cram more logical fallacies into a live stream than California can into a budget deficit. Today we're diving into a couple of his greatest hits from his LA fire coverage, where he manages to defend bloated bureaucracy, justify glaring policy failures, and mock anyone who dares to question the dogma of DEI or climate hysteria. We'll unpack how his arguments collapse under the weight of their own hypocrisy, from dismissing concerns about firefighter qualifications to ridiculing private solutions for the state's incompetence. Hasan isn't just a commentator. He's the poster child for the left's selective outrage machine, always ready to pivot, deflect, or outright mock the obvious flaws in their worldview. Let's dig in and expose the absurdities one clip at a time.
Luckily, Los Angeles has its first female and LGBTQ fire chief. Rob Taylor responds, and that's significant. Why? I don't know her, but I hope she was just the best person for the job. If not, the community pays the price. Here is libs of TikTok also making sure that everybody understands that the fire chief is a lesbian and therefore bad at her job. And that's the reason why these fires are ripping through the Palisades.
The department is launching its first ever Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Bureau. It is dedicated to ensuring a fair and equal workplace environment.
Eyewitness News reporter Christian Cordero is live in North Hollywood with more on what it entails and why it's necessary.
I'm sorry, you are the most delusional person on the planet. If you look at a fire that's ripping through these densely slammed neighborhoods, and your first inclination is, oh, I would sure hate that a lesbian woman is fighting these fires. You're out of your mind, dude. What are you talking about? I don't care what the background of the person is that's braving the flames. Like, what are we doing at this point? This is one of the most insane things I've ever seen. Absolutely no one should care about this unless you are so pathetically lasered in on the background of the person. You care more about that than the job that they're doing. Like, imagine pointing the finger at the person who is currently fighting these wildfires as you sit at home thousands of miles away, safe, okay? And being like, you know who's the real problem here? The people that are fighting these fires. Los Angeles recently appointed its very first female LGBTQ fire chief with the goal of recruiting more women and gay firefighters. Like, who cares? We need more firefighters in general. Who cares if they are gay or women? Or gay women, or trans. I don't care. Why would I care? Why would you care? When someone is pulling you out of a burning building, do you go, are you a homosexual, sir? Because if so, yuck, I would rather die.
Pure intellectual train wreck from Hasan Piker. He poses a question that he clearly thinks is a rhetorical haymaker. Who cares if they're gay, women, or trans? Why would anyone care about that when someone is pulling you out of a burning building? Hasan, the problem isn't who someone is. It's whether they can do the job. Let's use some real-world data to dismantle his nonsense. First, let's talk about DEI policies in firefighting and their potential impact on hiring standards. In 2014, the Los Angeles Fire Department faced allegations of bending physical fitness standards for recruits in order to meet diversity goals. Internal investigations revealed that candidates who failed written and physical agility tests were still allowed to proceed through the hiring process. A report from the LA Times found that over half of the department's 2013 recruit class were related to current or former firefighters, raising questions about fairness and qualification. Hasan conveniently ignores cases like this where diversity efforts clash with competence. Now let's look at data from New York City, where the FDNY faced a federal discrimination lawsuit in 2007 over its hiring practices. To address diversity concerns, the department lowered its written exam standards, leading to criticisms that unqualified candidates were being hired. According to a 2013 report from ProPublica, the city spent nearly $98 million in legal fees and settlements related to the case. By 2019, the department's diversity increased, but internal reviews highlighted gaps in physical fitness among new recruits, causing concerns about their ability to meet the demands of the job. Hasan also claims these roles are so competitive and training intensive that DEI policies couldn't possibly lower standards. But the facts don't support that claim. In 2022, the National Fire Protection Association reported that volunteer firefighters, who make up 65% of the U.S. firefighting personnel, are in sharp decline, with 13% drop in volunteers over the last decade. Meanwhile, urban departments are struggling to fill full-time positions as retirements outpace recruitment. A 2020 report from Firehouse magazine highlighted that the average firefighter applicant pool has shrunk by 25% since 2010. This isn't a field overflowing with qualified candidates. It's one desperately trying to keep up with demand. Now, Hasan's dismissal of these concerns also ignores the broader context of wildfire management in California, where the stakes couldn't be higher. According to the California Legislative Analyst's Office, wildfires have burned over 7.2 million acres since 2018, with damage costs exceeding $12 billion annually. Yet California's firefighting budget has consistently lagged behind these challenges. In 2021, the state allocated $1 billion for wildfire prevention, but a CAP radio investigation revealed that only 19% of the planned projects were completed by the year's end. Hasan brushes aside these systemic failures, preferring to mock those raising concerns as paranoid bigots, when, in fact, the facts show a much different picture. Finally, let's address the elephant in the room, the false dichotomy Hasan sets up. He frames this debate as though critics are choosing between diversity and safety. In reality, the concern is whether diversity initiatives are being implemented at the expense of hiring the best candidates. A 2021 study from the Rand Corporation on DEI in the military, a field with similarly high-stakes roles, found that while DEI programs improved representation, they sometimes led to morale issues and perceptions of lowered standards among personnel. These findings raise valid concerns about balancing inclusivity with operational excellence. So let's recap. Hasan's argument relies on straw men, ignores historical examples of compromised hiring standards, and completely disregards the broader challenges facing firefighting today. Diversity is a noble goal, but when it's achieved by cutting corners, the consequences are measured not in political points, but in lives and property lost. Maybe Hasan should spend less time grandstanding and more time grappling with the real-world impacts of the policies he so desperately defends.
So the fire department cuts were minimal. It's minimal in comparison to the ginormous budgets spent. Yes, if the overall budget is like around $800 million, then yes, a 17 million cut is going to be minimal in comparison. But it doesn't matter because they need 100 extra million on top of that. And if it's going in the opposite direction of their need, that means that they're underfunded. That's the point. But having said that, obviously more firefighters that are better equipped, more training, more preventative measures, especially with like communicating with the public in dangerous areas that are at risk for wildfires, you need to have constant upkeep to ensure that there is like a dry brush that's cleared out and things of that nature, right? Like all of that stuff, even if you did everything right, even if they got $100 extra million, there is no 100% certainty that they would have stopped all of the fires. You understand what I'm saying? There's always going to be a limit. How many resources you could throw at a problem when the problem becomes too large? Blame the gardeners, eh?
Another gem from Hasan, where he tries to dismiss concerns about underfunded firefighting efforts in California with a sweeping claim. Even with $100 million extra, there's no guarantee they could stop all the fires. Ah, yes, the classic defeatist argument. If perfection isn't achievable, why bother trying? It's the kind of logic that says, why fix the roof? It's gonna rain again anyway. Except, in this case, the roof is California and the rain is a wildfire season that incinerates neighborhoods and costs billions every year. Let's dissect this dumbassery. First, Hasan's argument is a textbook example of a false dilemma. The idea that either you stop all fires with funding or funding doesn't matter at all. This is absurd. Adequate resources don't guarantee perfection, but they drastically improve outcomes. A report from the California Legislative Analyst's Office found that wildfire damage has increased over the past decade, not because wildfires are inherently unstoppable, but because prevention measures like clearing dry brush and creating fire breaks aren't being implemented at the necessary scale. In 2021, California allocated $1 billion for wildfire prevention, but only 19% of the planned projects were completed. That's not just a failure of funding, it's a failure of prioritization and execution. Hasan conveniently skips over the nuance because it undercuts his narrative that money isn't the problem. Now let's address his suggestion that the problem is too big for any additional funding to make a difference. This is laughable when you consider the numbers. California's firefighting firefighting force is woefully under-resourced. The National Interagency Fire Center reported that federal firefighting crews are short-staffed by nearly 30%, with the majority of wildland firefighters earning less than $15 an hour as of 2021. Meanwhile, California relies on inmate labor for nearly 30% of its wildfire response, a controversial practice that reflects just how desperate the state is for manpower. So when Hasan shrugs off calls for additional funding, he's essentially saying, let's keep relying on underpaid workers and prisoners instead of addressing the systemic gaps. The irony of his comment is that he is very much against prisoners being used to fight the fires, and yet he's actively downplaying the budget cuts that have led to the very practices he criticizes. Really makes you question if he has a fully functional brain. And let's not ignore the broader context here. Wildfires in California aren't just natural disasters. They're preventable crises exacerbated by years of poor land management and infrastructure neglect. Above-ground power lines are one of the leading causes of wildfire sparks, as seen in the 2018 Camp Fire, which killed 85 people and caused $16.5 billion in damages. The culprit, a 100-year-old power line that PG&E failed to maintain. Investing in underground power lines and modernizing electrical grids could significantly reduce fire risks, but instead of holding the state accountable for decades of negligence, Hasan waves his hands and insists that no amount of money can solve the problem. It's a lazy co-op that ignores real solutions. Now, what's particularly rich is that Hasan frames this as an issue of unavoidable natural disasters, while ignoring the government's role in mismanaging resources. California voters approved $7.5 billion in bonds for water and wildfire infrastructure in 2014, but as of 2022, not a single new dam or reservoir has been built to store runoff that could be used for firefighting efforts. Instead, 80% of the state's water runoff is sent straight to the Pacific Ocean for environmental purposes. This isn't about money being unavailable, it's about money being wasted or poorly allocated. Hasan's refusal to engage with these facts reveals either willful ignorance or ideological blindness. But the worst part about Hasan's argument is the implied moral superiority. By dismissing claims for more funding, he positions himself as above the fray, mocking critics while offering no substantive alternatives. It's the rhetorical equivalent of standing in a burning building, scoffing at the fire department and saying, well, they couldn't save everything anyway. Sure, Hasan, let's just throw up our hands and keep doing nothing. That'll definitely help. But wait. That's actually straight out of the Marxist playbook. Let everything burn down so you can topple the power structure and make it serve your own interests. Guess it all makes sense in the end. The reality is simple. Funding isn't a silver bullet. It's a critical piece of the puzzle. More resources mean more firefighters, better equipment, and improved prevention strategies, all of which save lives and property. Hasan's dismissive rhetoric isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. By minimizing the importance of addressing these gaps, he's excusing systemic failures that leave Californians vulnerable year after year. Maybe instead of laughing off these concerns, Hasan should focus on the facts and maybe, just maybe, recognize that solving big problems requires more than smug one-liners.
Private fire brigades. Rick Caruso is a multi-billionaire real estate developer that owns numerous malls all around Los Angeles. He also owns a mall in the Pacific Palisades. Rick Caruso, being the unimaginably wealthy person that he is, of course, hired private brigades to protect his mall in the Pacific Palisades. He also ran for mayor and almost won. He's a Republican that swapped his party loyalty, his party, right before this election, specifically so that he could turn around and potentially win the mayoral race. Now, he hired private fire brigades to defend the Pacific Palisades Mall, and they actually did defend the Pacific Palisades Mall. Here it is. Here's a video of the entire Caruso property in Palisades Village remains untouched while surrounding homes and properties have been completely destroyed. People will say, oh, this is because this is a newer structure and is up to standard on the new fire codes that were implemented in 2008 and onward. But that is not the only reason. The other reason is because, like I said, he hired a private fire brigade to ensure that his property remained intact. In that process, he found out that there was limited amounts of water that his private fire brigades could use. He made a big stink about it. He said, "This is, there's no fire, there's no water in the Palisades. What the hell's going on?" And then obviously everyone went along with that. But that is the reason why a lot of people started talking about the water hydrants running out of water. But that is also the reason why, as you can see here, these structures are intact, whereas everything else in the surrounding region is engulfed in flame. Private firefighters. It sounds dystopian. It sounds illegal. It absolutely is not.
Hasan calls private water brigades dystopian but not illegal and criticizes wealthy individuals like Rick Caruso for hiring them to protect their properties during the LA wildfires. Hasan, if private fire brigades are dystopian, what does that make a government that can't even provide basic fire protection? Because that's the real issue here. A systemic failure so glaring that people are forced to pay out of pocket to do what the state refuses or is incapable of doing. Let's start with why private fire brigades exist in the first place. California's government has been chronically mismanaging wildfire prevention and response efforts for decades. The Los Angeles Fire Department, for example, operates on an annual budget of roughly $895 million, a number that sounds impressive until you realize how little of it is actually spent on proactive wildfire management. Despite voters approving $7.5 billion in bonds in 2014 to improve water and wildfire infrastructure, there have been no new dams or reservoirs built, and 80% of runoff water is still being dumped into the Pacific Ocean for environmental purposes. The state's refusal to prioritize effective land management, including clearing dry brush and updating electrical infrastructure, has left its fire prevention strategies laughably inadequate. Hasan conveniently ignores this because holding California's leadership, Democrat leadership, accountable doesn't fit his Democrat lefty narrative. I think I emphasized enough the partisan spin here. And then there's Rick Caruso, who hired private firefighters to protect his Pacific Palisades Mall while nearby homes burned. Hasan frames this as a moral failing of capitalism rather than the inevitable consequence of a broken system. Here's the reality. Caruso's property wasn't saved because of privilege. It was saved because he took proactive measures the state couldn't or wouldn't provide. California's wildfire season is so poorly managed that private firefighting brigades have become a $4 billion industry, according to research from IBIS World. These brigades, often employed by insurance companies or wealthy individuals, use their own equipment, trucks, and resources to safeguard properties. They're not stealing public resources. They're compensating for their absence. Hasan also glosses over the fact that private fire brigades aren't just protecting the rich. Many homeowners in rural areas rely on private contractors during wildfire season because public fire departments are stretched too thin to respond in time. In 2018, CAL FIRE reported that response times in rural areas could exceed 30 minutes, a delay that can mean the difference between saving a home and losing everything. If anything, private brigades highlight the inequities caused by state failures, not by capitalism. But Hasan would rather mock their existence than address why they've become necessary in the first place. His argument is a textbook appeal to emotion, designed to paint private firefighting as some dystopian nightmare while deflecting from the real culprit, the state's inability to manage its resources effectively. By labeling these brigades as some symbol of inequality, Hasan distracts from the fact that California's own policies have exacerbated wildfire risks. Decades of environmental regulations have made it nearly impossible to conduct controlled burns or remove vegetation near power lines. In 2020, the Public Policy Institute of California revealed that 90% of the state's high-risk wildfire zones remain untreated due to bureaucratic red tape. And let's not forget the sheer hypocrisy of his criticism. Hasan loves to rail against the private sector while conveniently ignoring the benefits it brings. Private brigades don't just protect mansions. They also safeguard critical infrastructure like hospitals, schools, and even public utilities. During the 2020 Bobcat fire, private contractors were deployed to protect a water treatment plant that supplied drinking water to over 200,000 residents. Without them, the damage could have been catastrophic. But sure, Hasan. Let's call it dystopian because it makes for a snappier soundbite. The reality is private fire brigades are a symptom of a failing system, not the cause. Their existence doesn't expose the greed of capitalism. It exposes the incompetence of a state that can't meet the basic needs of its people. Hasan's take is all heat and no light. A lazy critique designed to stoke outrage while offering no solutions. If you want to talk about dystopia, look no further than a government that forces its citizens to fend for themselves in the face of preventable disasters. Maybe instead of scoffing at the people stepping in to fill the gaps, Hasan should aim his criticism at the real source of the problem, the systemic failures he's so eager to excuse. Who could have known? Hasan is nothing more than a bootlicker. That's pretty par for the course for a commie.
Climate change deniers are now somehow blaming wildfires on black people, some of the most innovative racism I've ever seen. Los Angeles deliberately set out to exclude white men from becoming firefighters, and now they don't have enough firefighters to prevent their city from burning to the ground. DEI is a cancer that destroys everything it touches. Dude, you are out of your mind, dude. This is a statement that is so utterly insane. What is going on, dude? The chief said it? Yeah, the chief said there are not enough firefighters to fight 4 massive wildfires when there are 80-mile winds that are blowing the fire. It's impossible to contain it. That is normal, okay? Because what is going on is abnormal. The proper preventative measure would have been to train and hire more firefighters, but that would require money beforehand, okay? More money to be spent on training firefighters beforehand. That is a real problem, okay? What is crazy, and remember, 30% of firefighters that fight these wildfires are literally slaves in the prison system in the state of California, California, woke California. Remember that. So like even under normal circumstances, they don't have enough people. You're late to the party. Some publications are doing exactly that.
Hasan begins by reading an inflammatory tweet aloud. Climate change deniers are now somehow blaming wildfires on black people, some of the most innovative racism I've ever seen. While Hasan doesn't explicitly endorse this claim, his decision to amplify it without critique or clarification is telling. He uses a tweet as a springboard to dismiss broader criticisms of California's wildfire management as absurd or rooted in bigotry. This is a textbook straw man where a fringe narrative is propped up to avoid addressing valid critiques. Most critics aren't making wild, racially charged claims. They're pointing to well-documented issues like poor land management, firefighter shortages, and resource misallocation. But Hasan doesn't touch these substantive points, preferring to ridicule an exaggerated claim that's easier to mock than to refute. Hasan then pivots to another controversial statement, mocking the idea that DEI initiatives have contributed to firefighting shortages. Los Angeles deliberately set out to exclude white men from becoming firefighters, and now they don't have enough firefighters to prevent their city from burning to the ground. DEI is a cancer that destroys everything it touches. Now, while Hasan derides this as insane, he fails to engage with the underlying concern. Whether prioritizing diversity over merit can lead to unintended consequences in high-stakes fields like firefighting. This is a valid discussion when lives and property are on the line. But Hasan's dismissive tone and lack of engagement with evidence sidestep the seriousness of the issue. For instance, concerns about reduced hiring standards are not new. A 2020 audit of the LA Fire Department found inconsistencies in recruitment practices, with hiring standards varying significantly based on departmental targets rather than uniform requirements. Similarly, a 2021 ProPublica investigation revealed that some municipal firefighting departments across the U.S. reported pressure to relax physical fitness requirements to meet diversity goals, raising questions about balancing inclusivity with maintaining high standards in life-critical roles. These aren't fabricated concerns. They're documented challenges that demand a serious conversation. Hasan's outright dismissal only avoids addressing these important trade-offs. Then Hasan shifts gears again, acknowledging the chief said there are not enough firefighters to fight massive wildfires when there are 80-mile winds that are blowing the fire. It's impossible to contain it. This is a critical admission. Hasan frames the problem as inevitable rather than a failure of preparation. This is a classic false inevitability fallacy. Sure, 80-mile winds make firefighting incredibly difficult, but that doesn't absolve California's leadership from failing to address preventable vulnerabilities. Why hasn't the state invested in more firefighters, better training, and modernized infrastructure? California consistently falls short in long-term planning. A 2022 report from the California State Auditor highlighted that CAL FIRE has been operating with outdated equipment, including fire engines that average 20 years in age and are increasingly unreliable. Moreover, firefighting departments across the state are struggling with recruitment due to below average pay compared to neighboring states like Oregon and Nevada. In 2022, the California Professional Firefighters Union reported that firefighter vacancies were leaving some areas severely understaffed, leading to longer response times and delayed containment efforts. Hasan's failure to address these systemic issues, instead chalking it up to insurmountable wins, lets the culprits off the hook. But it's not like he'd have an interest in actually holding any of them accountable. After all, they are on his side of the political aisle, and we all know how partisan he can be. Finally, Hasan injects a provocative claim. He says 30% of firefighters that fight these wildfires are literally slaves in the prison system in the state of California. While the use of inmate labor in wildfire response is a legitimate issue worth discussing, Hasan's framing here is deliberately inflammatory. Inmate firefighters, part of California's conservation camp program, are paid between $2 and $5 per day, plus an additional $1 per hour when fighting fires. While these wages are shockingly low, they do not account for the root issues behind California's staffing shortages. California has struggled to recruit full-time firefighters due to low wages and high attrition rates. A 2021 report by Statista found that the average starting salary for a CAL FIRE firefighter was only $43,000. Well below what is needed to attract candidates in one of the country's most expensive states. Instead of addressing these economic and policy failures, Hasan uses the prison labor issue as a rhetorical pivot, shifting the narrative toward systemic oppression and away from California's failures in addressing the wildfire crisis. What's even more dishonest about this segment is Hasan's refusal to grapple with the root causes of California's wildfire crisis. By focusing on fringe claims and using hyperbolic language, he distracts from the substantive critiques of land management, infrastructure, and funding priorities. Poor land management is a major issue. As the California Legislative Analyst's Office noted in 2021, over 90% of high-risk wildfire zones in the state remain untreated. Meanwhile, California has also failed to upgrade its aging electrical grid, which has been responsible for sparking numerous fires. PG&E alone has been linked to over 1,500 wildfires since 2014, including the 2018 Camp Fire, which killed 85 people and caused $16.5 billion in damages. These systemic failures are well documented, yet Hasan avoids engaging with them. I wonder why. The real question isn't whether DEI is a cancer or whether climate change deniers are racists. It's why the wealthiest state in the U.S. continues to leave itself so vulnerable to preventable disasters. Hasan's rhetoric might energize his audience, but it does nothing to solve the problem. If anything, it perpetuates the same cycle of neglect, deflection, and misplaced priorities that fuels California's wildfire crisis year after year. Hasan would do well to put down the hyperbole and pick up the data, because the facts are not on his side. California's wildfire crisis is a catastrophic failure of governance, infrastructure, and resource management, yet much of the debate surrounding it has been reduced to partisan mudslinging and ideological posturing. Hasan Piker's commentary exemplifies this problem by deflecting legitimate critiques with straw man arguments and hyperbolic dismissals. From amplifying absurd tweets to mocking concerns about DEI initiatives and firefighter shortages, Hasan glosses over systemic issues like outdated infrastructure, incompleted wildfire prevention projects, and PG&E's negligence. California's inability to allocate its $300 billion budget effectively, complete planned mitigation efforts, or modernize its electrical grid has left the state vulnerable to increasingly devastating wildfires, issues that transcend partisanship but are conveniently ignored in favor of performative outrage. But let's get real here for a second. How long can California's leadership dodge accountability while its residents suffer the consequences? Why hasn't the state addressed glaring failures in wildfire prevention, land management, and water infrastructure despite having billions in funding and decades of warnings? Are DEI policies truly enhancing public safety, Or are they creating new challenges in critical fields like firefighting? And why is it easier for commentators like Hasan to dismiss critics as partisan rather than engage with the facts? The answers to these questions could reshape the narrative and spark real solutions, if only they were asked more often. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.